Welcome to TechLeader, where we go beyond the AI hype and go into real world strategy. We're speaking today with Anil Prasad. We have the privilege of having him on board on this call with us. Anil is recognized as one of the 100 most influential AI leaders in the US. He's managed product and engineering teams hands on with 20 plus years leading global teams across Fortune hundreds and startups alike. Anil's built platforms that have powered more than $4 billion in outcomes, modernized legacy systems, and scaled Gen AI right into production. His expertise spans full stack development, really, ML ops, cloud, data, and advanced AI. And he's led transformations in all the high stakes industries, healthcare, fintech, life sciences, with a deep focus on impact at the grassroots. Today, we'll unpack the playbook for AI that delivers, not just demos. We'll explore the implications of ethical AI, scaling responsibly, and how we could go about building teams that thrive amidst constant change. Anil brings that rare combination of technical depth and strategic clarity. Someone who's written code, scaled teams, and built centers of excellence from ground up, and helped C-suites make the leap from legacy to leading edge. So here we are, Anil. Thank you for helping us unpack that playbook for implementing AI that really actually delivers the challenges of integrating it into legacy systems, helping us understand those. So we're really glad you could join us today.
I'm happy to be here, Devang. That was a good set of introduction. Hopefully, I can keep up to it, but I'm here to learn. I think everything starts with learning and contributing. So I would love to hear your perspectives as well. Yeah, let's dive in, and I'm looking forward.
Perfect, perfect. Yeah, let's dig right in. So Anil, I'm curious. There's something that many executives struggle with, and the other day I was speaking to a CTO who highlighted just that. So let's start with that. How do you kind of separate AI applications that create real world, genuine value from those that are just kind of impressive demos? You see a lot of demos these days. So when you're evaluating potential AI initiatives, do you have like a mental framework that you use to distinguish between a truly genuine opportunity and an expensive experimentation at that?
That's a very common question. That's trending really, Devang, and everybody wants to know that. I think I've interacted with product leaders, I've interacted with engineers, executives.
Yeah.
So what I typically do is and have some kind of a mental framework when I want to separate the real value versus what is the hype, right? I follow this five best practices which I would like to share. Again, these are my views. What I do typically is when I interact, start anything, I start with the business outcome and not the technology first. So that mindset is very important. That every AI initiative must be anchored to a very crystal clear business goal. What I mean by that examples could be reducing customer churn by 15% or cutting the processing time by 60%. So those are some of the real values that should be defined the real business outcome, right? The second one of the principle I follow is to quantify the AI value with across like different dimensions, right? Across five dimensions. One is I can think of is more financial, which is very important to every company. So there should be a direct correlation and impact to a revenue or a cost. So that is one thing that is important. Operationally, we need to align achieving gains in efficiency and then reducing the errors. The third one is more strategic in nature, which is where you got to have your business have some kind of a competitive advantage. The fourth one is more risk mitigation, where you're able to detect compliance errors or you can mitigate, fraudulent detections of data, right? Innovation, of course, is part of everything we do. So new products and services is something you have to constantly research and try to do pilot and implement. For example, in a recent AI innovation project, we measured just not the cost savings, but also the reduction in processing errors. So that was the one thing we did while implementing the AI. The other one is I would employ a very rigorous and phased evaluation. What I mean by that is I need to phase out my pilots with a very clear success criteria with an outcome defined from the business. And then I would go through a proof of concept phase. And then I would talk about how do I scale. Once I get it accurate enough, the model is working and scalable, then I would talk about how do I scale across within the team or across teams in the enterprise. and then need to have some kind of a KPI for every phase you define. That is another thing is very important. The fourth one is about having an impact, just not with the model, the ML models, but also the users adapting. For example, I'll tell you one thing. Uber, they found a very highly accurate AI model. They defined it that if they can integrate into the driver workflow, that is what their success criteria meant. So that was a successful implementation that Uber did, as an example, right?
Yeah.
The final thing is about having that governance, a lean governance process, and also some kind of integration. So the real value comes in when AI is integrated across core business systems, as you know, right? With the monitoring and governance, those are very important criteria to have to differentiate between a hype versus the real AI value.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love it the way you put it, it's a very measured strategy where you have KPIs that are kind of constantly tracking real world progress, while you have a governance framework that keeps things in check. So it's kind of like a well-regulated strategy that has guardrails everywhere, and you're constantly on top of it, seeing how things are progressing and starting small and kind of scaling it, you know, uh, from the ground
Absolutely.
up.
Absolutely. I think you put it in a nice way. Yes, absolutely. Those are
Yeah.
important criteria.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just thinking, Anil, so you have that very unique insight, having managed engineering teams, of 200 plus people. That's quite something. It's exceedingly rare, and
Yeah.
doing it successfully in AI transformation is even rarer, so to say. So most executives, really struggle once they hit kind of 50 AI engineers, and 200 is really something. So what organizational patterns have you discovered, in the course of your work that you find actually work at scale? If you could, for example, walk me
Yeah.
through how you structure large AI teams differently from how you would a traditional software team, and any mistakes that you've seen other leaders make, when they try to maybe scale too quickly in the world that's moving just too fast.
No, I think that is a very important question everybody is asking right now. One thing though, what I've seen is you know the I'll take an example of cloud transformation, or I'll take about an example of how I would approach an AI implementation, right? Um, so just to make it clear, right, the AI transformation today is fundamentally different on how enterprises are executing it, correct? Now, typically in a cloud transformation program, you would talk about more project management, more scheduling, more cost. But in a AI transformation, you're thinking about culture, you're thinking about talent, training, upskilling, and constant organizational identity, right? Now, one of the things I've seen is that cloud formation is very technical in nature, and it's more operational in nature, right? Which means you're talking about migrating workloads, modernizing infrastructure, optimizing cost, ensuring business continuity, and having some kind of clear project management and governance. And everything is aligning back to the IT with business needs. Whereas AI in a transformation is much more transformational, more cultural in nature, and it's not about deploying new tools, right? It's fundamentally about thinking how people, process, and technology would integrate and would create an impact.
Yeah.
And again, AI, what I've seen is it changes the job roles, it amplifies our day-to-day functions, it also impacts the workflows. And then the biggest challenge I've seen is mostly the human side of it, right? When you are talking about AI transformation, experimentation and continuous learning is part of AI transformation programs. Now, the second most thing I've seen is that the mindset of leaders, where they need to think about move from project management aspects to more transformational stewardship, right? What I mean by that is that cloud leaders typically are like excellent project managers, but then they think about timelines and budget and technical integration. But AI leaders are more like stewards. They champion vision, they foster cross-functional collaboration, and these are the areas they need to focus on. Um, the other thing I've seen is scaling the AI team versus traditional IT or cloud teams. Some of the factors that contribute is that traditional engineering teams typically scale linearly, right? You have more work, which means you add more people and more roles. So that's kind of
Yeah.
typically how you scale up a traditional engineering team.
Yeah.
Whereas in AI team, it is slightly different. because you need a blend of skill sets and you need a broad set of stakeholders to be engaged. For example, data scientists, machine learning engineers, MLOps engineers, domain experts, product managers, right? Even QA teams are also part of the whole ecosystem, right? Scaling isn't about hiring in AI world. It's more about orchestrating the diverse talent. It's about building adaptable processes. It's ensuring that everyone can work in a typical AI using AI tool. So you need to identify and fill those gaps quickly and have some kind of a culture where continuous upskilling and cross-functional integrations are core, right? What I've seen, the surprised me the most is about the cultural assistance or change management, right? Typically required for AI. So with cloud, unlike cloud, you could actually do it and you can set and forget infrastructure, you can, but AI system require constant tuning, retraining the models.
Yeah.
Human in the loop feedback is very important. These are some of the dimensions I have noticed typically when you want to scale an AI team and transform programs within the enterprise.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's more of a process, really, more of a journey than, simply arriving at your destination and kind of and ending the journey. You never really arrive. You're constantly innovating, getting the culture right and then getting it right again. So yeah,
Yeah,
that definitely makes a lot
absolutely.
of sense.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, so let's take your thoughts, to the high stakes sectors out there, because you have a lot of expertise in healthcare and in, fintech, even in the life sciences in one of your roles earlier. So just
Yeah.
wanted to know, and these are industries where, getting things wrong has deadly consequences. So can you tell us about a moment where, you had to make a high stakes decision about AI integration in a very regulated environment, so to say? And how did you balance that innovation speed with the drag of compliance requirements like HIPAA or FDA regulations, because every day of delay that you incur kind of costs millions. So how do you balance innovation with compliance is what I'm trying to understand.
That's a very good question. Fortunately, Devang, I've been a part of my recent experiences, in my recent 2 or 3 jobs where I was right in the heart of dealing with compliance teams, legal teams, dealing
Yeah,
with the IT teams, infrastructure teams, where you have to think about guardrails like VPN, right? Having access to ChatGPT or some kind of enterprise GPT tool within the VPN, right? That means that you're only rolling it out to users within the core network, right? So those are the
yeah,
areas I've been across. So now talking about healthcare, fintech, and life sciences, they demand a very fundamentally different approach. Now, a real moment came through when we faced a key decision point where AI systems accuracy depended on the real patient data, right? But then using that would be a HIPAA violation for PHI and many concerns around HIPAA. So, but again, stripping the PHI data would mean that the model performance would degrade. And
yeah,
and right, but the risk is more because when you're basically risking the clinical value and business impact. So my approach to balance the speed and compliance are a few things, right? One is it's important to think about a risk-based framework. So what I mean by that is every AI use case needs to have some kind of a risk level or risk score, right? For example, I would classify them. I would tag the in a life sciences world, you have diagnostic tools and clinical decision support tools. They
yeah,
always are under high risk because the EU, the European AI Act and FDA guidelines, they trigger the strictest controls. So there's always, the scrutiny for, especially for life sciences and healthcare. So lower risk applications, like typically you want to schedule a meeting or scheduling bots. So those have lighter compliance. So it's important to have a risk-based framework, identifying what is high risk versus what is low risk. So that is one important. Second is to follow more like a hybrid model strategy. So when I say just the model itself, right? So what I mean by that is you have pre-built LLMs, which can be employed and deployed for generic non-sensitive tasks like summarization or report reading and so on and so forth, right? It's more about report generation or summarization. Whereas when you're dealing with these healthcare or sensitive data, it's important to employ a more controlled, more proprietary models, which are PHI regulated workflows, right? So that is another thing which is important to do that. You have to identify and search the right model which is more tightly controlled. Now, the
Yeah.
other part I've seen is to have a data governance and automation, give that an importance. So multi-tenancy framework is one way to check the compliance checks, right? It's part of the design. As you're building the model and testing and using it, compliance checks should be done at every step. There are examples like, for example, in one of the two, when somebody is putting a prompt, right, to the GPT tool, we do a
Yeah.
compliance check and display, whether it's approved or not. So that level of multi-tenancy framework or audit check, the compliance check is important. Then you got to have minimum access, for the users who need to access. For example, AI scheduling assistant only sees appointment data, right? So you got to make sure only that data is available. So having that access to that data for AI model, which is more minimal, what is required is important. And I've seen this vendor and internal stakeholders alignment is also important. So I have something like a business associate agreement or BAA, they call it. So you got to have that BAA with the vendor for compliance before integrating with their solutions, right? And then finally, I would say that continuous compliance is important as part of the design rather than doing a compliance at the end. So that's another important factor that differentiates how you build a highly compliant solution versus you're scratching or you're searching for risks. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And thank you for sharing those thoughts with us, Anil. In fact, that got me thinking. I really lo love the way you put it into words. So basically, being agile in your compliance frameworks as well, and not compliance not just being an afterthought, but being a part of the entire developmental life cycle right from the very beginning. So because it's very common for engineers, to be kind of agile with software development when it comes to compliance. If you kind of think of compliance too as a as a part of a larger agile framework that kind of sets things in perspective. And you also mentioned setting risk scores, kind of giving risk scores to every item on the task list. So I think that's another fantastic idea. Also kind of helps set things into motion in terms of the KPIs data, because
Yeah.
you're putting numbers on things, and that helps quantify risks. So absolutely lovely, very interesting points in there. And when it comes to ML ops and DevSecOps, so taking the things that we've just discussed, Anil, these DevSecOps isn't just a buzzword for you. It really means all about operational reality at scale. And most organizations, will struggle with ML model deployment beyond the POC stage. And you've actually built ML ops pipelines that operate in production across high stakes regulated environments. So if you think about it, what's the biggest operational challenge that surprised you, maybe even caught you off guard? Although that's rare considering the industry areas that you're working in. But what are the biggest operational challenges that you've discovered, moving from a traditional DevOps pipeline to ML ops, at an enterprise scale?
Yeah, I think I'll mention this clearly. In like 4 years back, DevOps was already an established, saturated area, but then enterprises were looking into integrating security as part of
Security.
DevOps, right?
Yeah.
So I was fortunate to set up integrate the security as part of DevOps at R1 RCM or CloudMed. So this is something that came out as an audit, clearly as a red flag in the audit where the software was not secure, right? The data was not secure. That was something that
Yeah.
came out, and and I was fortunate to lead that from the front where I integrated security as part of DevOps, right? So that's the thing I can remember now. The shift happened after we had the successful DevSecOps running. We then had more machine learning ops or ML ops. They call it AI ops. Different buzzwords are used today. The biggest challenge I've seen really is to the complexities and the volatility of the data and model artifacts, right? So when you talk about model, the artifacts are totally different versus in DevSecOps what you deal with. In DevOps, you're still typically dealing with static and more deterministic kind of code artifacts, right? Like once you're deployed, your software behaves predictably and your version control is very straightforward. But ML ops is a different animal, right? It's just not the code because machine learning ops requires ever-changing data sets,
Yeah.
structured, unstructured, semi-structured, polystructured, those kind of data. And then there is multiple versions of models, features, and hyperparameters. Those three. Like hyperparameters is like temperature, setting up the model accuracy, and those factors are important, right? You got to have, because when you're looking at retesting a model, you're looking at the performance and how well it behaved and how well it performed. So you got to change those hyperparameters and maintain that baseline and changes. The other part is MLOps requires continuous retraining cycles. So then you got to combat the data and the drift problem. And the other, finally, the complex compliance and governance requirements are part of it, especially in regulated industries like health tech and fintech, right? As you know, what makes machine learning or MLOps uniquely challenging at scale is a couple of things. One is about the data management at scale, where data becomes the first class citizen for ML workflows to work effectively, right? You got to have a unified, clean, and governed data from disparate sources. And then you got to have cloud, on-prem, and hybrid environments where you're ingesting data from. The source is different. You got to have a unified, clean data for the model to work correctly. Data silos are existing, inconsistent formats, and unstructured data. They also add more risks to operational, right? That's one thing the MLOps, what I've seen, deals with. The other thing is about the versioning complexity. Um, unlike unlike DevSecOps or DevOps, where you version the code and configs, MLOps, you must version data sets, you must version features, model weights, training pipelines, and experimental results, right? Because the results are important to retrain or reevaluate a model, for example. So without this rigorous version control, like there are things like DVCs or ML flow, which could be used as a tool to implement that kind of repo for the ML models.
Yeah.
The other thing I've seen is model drift and continuous training. ML models degrade over time, unless because of data drift, right? Because when you have real data coming in, the model can drift, which means it's operating out of the established baselines.
Yeah.
ML pipelines must support automated retraining and redeployment, right? CI/CD, and they call it CT. We call it CT is continuous training. Right? That's what it stands for. So you got to have CI, CD, and CT with robust monitoring for accuracy, bias, and fairness. And then finally, collaboration with governance, security, and those are important factors, right? Especially in regulated industries, every pipeline must enforce strict access control, audit trails, and compliance checks like HIPAA, FDA, PCI DSS, all those regulatory checks. Security is non-negotiable, but then governance should also be automated and continuously monitored. So that is the way I would approach AI, ML flow, and ML ops and DevSecOps.
Yeah, and it's very interesting the way you kind of bring in continuous testing alongside CI and CD. So you're taking even DevSecOps a step further to kind of keep in tune with the current times that we are living in. And as you mentioned, I think static rules no longer hold as they would in DevSecOps or in DevOps. And it's about constantly engineering for newer challenges and retraining on the fly. Do you think this is also an appropriate point, I think, to kind of bring in that human into the loop? Because while you're automating the retraining, you ought to have a strict human control over, what it is, uh, what do you expect the model kind of goes? When does it go out of sync? And when do we bring these automated controls on? So I think that's also where human oversight would be critical, which is far
Yeah,
from the hype that people see all the time. AI isn't really
yeah,
replacing humans after all.
yeah, yeah. Devang, I think in DevOps, when developers do check in a code, they create a PR, right? PR request, and then as a architect or lead, you're reviewing and approving the code and merge of the code. In ML
Yeah,
ops is very similar, that especially, but the artifacts are different, right? So when an engineer or scientist or product leader wants to make changes to the existing setup of ML, the machine learning model, you got to have that kind of governance and reviews. So the artifacts are different, right? It is about
yeah.
data being updated, different. It's about versioning information changing. It is about changing to the logic. So the artifacts are different, but the process still remains the same, where somebody is creating a PR, and then before you merge the changes, you need to have some kind of a multi-step review. So data
Yeah.
is fine, data pass, and then operationally, it is passed. Because sometimes I've seen that when you deploy unrealistic changes to the existing model, the infrastructure is not able to scale or support. So it's
Yeah.
going to not work at runtime. So you got to have operational review as well, along with the review across scientists and engineers. Yeah, that's a good valid point you called out. Thanks for calling that. That's the human in the loop, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so Gen AI and LLM integration, that's another very common theme that comes up every once in a while, and everyone's talking about it. But you are actually someone who's implementing it in production systems, in real world systems. So do you see that gap? And I'm again talking about the human in the loop here. Do you see a gap between the Gen AI hype and enterprise reality? Because I know cultures are not yet ready, people are not yet ready. But can you share an example where LLM integration delivered genuine business value, and what implementation actually looked like behind the scenes?
Yeah, this is an example which I stood in my mind. I was when I was researching about how do I go about implementing in my own case, right? I wanted to see some reference models across industries, and what I found is this is a fleet. There's a fleet company called COX2M. So COX2M, they have something like what they did is that they built a something KAYO fleet management, customer with real-time and natural language access to fleet data, right? So they implemented that KO fleet model to help, the drivers access information. So what they
Right.
built is something called a KO assistant, which is using RAG, retrieval augmented generation architecture. So it allowed users to ask questions in English, in plain text English. And then what the value they implemented is that, like for example, which routes had the most delays like last week, right? It gave them that information, real-time information of what was the statistics last week. And that gave them instant accurate answers from the live operational data, right? Now, that's one of the value the KO AI provided to the truck, the fleet operators, right? Now,
Yeah.
behind the scenes, I was reading through their implementation, whatever they shared, right? So they had various, like they had a data pipeline which was helping them to with real-time data ingestion and normalization of diverse fleet data sources. That's one thing they had implemented. They implemented a RAG layer, which is combining the LLM, the base model with the domain-specific knowledge base,
Yeah.
right? And for precise and context-aware responses. They also implemented governance and security, which means they provided strict access control, audit trails, and automated compliance checks, for example, right? And of course, the outcome they were able to deliver much more scalable, very cost-effective system that constantly improved the decision making or reduce the manual reporting and enhance the drivers or customer experience. So, I mean, this was an example I was reading through, though I didn't have a first-hand uh, experience implementing it because we were trying to implement, but I was looking at reference architecture, right? So this is something we that was noticeable in my mind, right? What it delivered is a clear business value, as you could see. It also had an enterprise-grade integration using those RAG framework and MLOps, right? They also had a good change management where the LLMs were positioned as collaborators and not just tools for automating tasks. So Gen AI's enterprise value is only unlocked when you move beyond pilots and focus on real business outcome, right? And robust integration across the different data sources is important. And and to top it off, you got to have a lean governance model that supports all your deployment and usage of your system and AI models.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in fact, you talked about the RAG layer and the way it kind of makes everything context aware and brings in that domain specific knowledge. So now you no longer have a generic LLM, but you have a RAG layer on top that's kind of making the responses more appropriate and possibly even reducing the instances of hallucinations. So that delivers clear business value, as you said. But what I'm also wondering, Anil, is that there's a lot of buzz on what Gen AI could do, and people have all sorts of ideas about the ways Gen AI could be integrated into existing workflows, to deliver business values. But is there an underappreciated area in this regard? Any areas that you feel that have not been talked about enough? Perhaps areas where AI has transformed operations or delivered majestic outcomes, but they're simply not talked about because all everyone's interested is in the hype.
Yeah, one thing that strikes out from my real experience in the field, Devang, is that I used to work at this utilities company, energy, one of the top in US. So they were trying to find a predictive modeling, solution for their, like there are these operational OT, they call it OT in a typical utility industry. So you're constantly monitoring the failures of equipments that are involved in distribution and generation of power, right? So what I've seen is that is one example I would like to call out. So predictive analytics is a very commonly missed out term, and that actually delivers ROIs and consistent performance, right? So what makes it underappreciated is that it's not flashy. It's not about like these Gen AIs and other things, the agentic framework, right? It's not flashy, number one. It's
Yeah,
very foundational in nature. It's a because based on your historical data and your current data, you're building a more predictive model, right? And it powers basically it can power everything, the predictive modeling around inventory management, for example, equipment failure notifications, demand forecasting, right? When you need to procure parts, for example, right? So that's one thing I've seen which is undervalued. It consistently delivers hard ROIs. I know I've seen that hand in hand, and I've really felt that experience where it can deliver that real value. It can reduce cost, it can reduce downtime. Where I talked about OT failures, better resource allocations, and it doesn't get the attention it needs because of these all glamour AI hypes. Um, One of the example I would like to call about is that the supply chain, the DHL supply chain, they deployed an AI-driven predictive analytics and then for across, I think, 200 or more than that North American warehouses. And as an outcome, what they had was a dynamic routing of pickers, increased productivity by like 10 to 15%. They had an AI-driven automation, like reducing costs by over 50% in some workflows, not every, but some workflows. And these are not theoretical. These are real daily operational data and advantage, DHL achieved, right? So yeah, I mean, predictive analytics for me is something that is undervalued and not recognized as a very foundational capability. So that is what I would call out.
yeah, yeah, and it also kind of well, ups the game in that it brings that proactive attribute to businesses, because now they're not simply responding to things with that predictive analytics. They're actually able to predict or get a fair idea of what's about to come. So kind of brings in that prophecy factor that is grounded in real world data. So yeah, so that is something that can really beat Gen AI in many things any day, even though it doesn't really live up, in terms of the hype and the Gen AI glamour, as you said. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in
And
fact, I'm fresh off the bat. I'm also trying to implement one of the predictive model for my existing use case here. So the timing is good, but then you're absolutely right.
yeah, yeah, makes sense. Yes. And most organizations, Anil, they really want to leverage AI, but they do not have a clue. Where should we really begin? So based on your experience, how can a company identify a high impact starting point for AI? Perhaps you could walk us through an example of how to start with a small pilot project. What makes for a good choice, and then how do you successfully scale it up once you've started small? Once it started showing some promise.
Yeah, this actually, Devang, this is a very good timing, I'm honestly saying, because Friday we had a meeting with my business, counterparts, and we exactly discussed some of these use cases, which I think, it's very timely, right? So what I've seen is some of the key things to launch a high impact AI is to start with a very focused and business aligned pilot that solves real pain points for the business. It's important to understand for engineers to understand the real business problem that could be solved. That is one thing. It should also deliver measurable ROIs. So, for example, how much metrics can I, when I get the baseline metrics, how much improvement I'm seeing, right? And it should be designed for scaling from day one. You should think about assuming that this, because the business problem, you're building it, so it should also be scalable. That is another
Yeah.
factor you got to think about. Now, some of the way to identify like high impact starting point would be pinpoint the exact business pain point. It is very important to map that, from day one, right before you start anything. Align with the strategic goals of the organization, right? The pilot, the POC or pilot, what you do should tie directly to the business objective. It could be, for example, you want to reduce cost, or you want to increase volume, or support more users, or improve customer satisfaction, improve your NPS score, right? Costco does that very well, right? Increasing how do you increase NPS score? That's a
Yeah,
very important factor for healthcare industries, right? How do you avoid AI for AI's sake, and how do you ensure the use cases prioritized by leadership? Those are one thing I've seen. And also the feasibility is important, which means that you're choosing the use case with which is accessible, you have quality data, and you have clear ownership and accountability, right? So a partnership should also be easier. Somebody who understands data and where you have data available, so you're not scattered across, right? So assess that feasibility before you pick on a use case, whether you have quality data, whether data is already procured and persistent and which you can leverage and reuse. That's another
yeah,
important, I call it assessing feasibility, right? Now, one of the example I would like to, this is a very thing everybody knows available in public domain is JP Morgan Chase, right?
yeah,
So they had a very targeted pain point, which I just loved. They wanted to automate the review of commercial loan agreements in the U.S., like a process that was consuming like thousands of lawyers and thousands of hours annually. So
yeah,
what they did is they put together a pilot that used AI to parse the contracts, and flag anomalies or directly address cost and repetitive tasks. That is something JP Morgan did. It had a clear business value to immediate time and cost saving. It was measurable success like reduce in manual review time and cost. And it had a great executive sponsorship, right? Operations leaders, they owned it, they co-owned the project with the business leaders to ensure buy-in. Now, once the pilot was successful, they were able to scale up, which means what they did is that they invested in building a secure infrastructure, partnering with those cloud and, right, integrated with the system that with the core banking applications. And they also constantly upskill their existing staff to use that AI tool to constantly pass and these loan applications, right? So the AI platform was called Coin, CY and Coin, and then eventually it handled contract reviews in seconds, with kind of eliminating like 360 or 360,000 hours of manual work. Um,
wow,
so yeah, I mean, the framework was successful. The pilot and scale up was something which is very real, right? So this is a manageable and high impact use case that JP Morgan Chase did it. Very clear success metrics, business alignment from the outset, from the beginning. They had a very good secure, I mean, the executive sponsorship and involving all stakeholders across the company. And finally, they were able to build a more scalable architecture, documenting the process, investing in the infrastructure, planning integration with existing systems across legacy platforms, right? And then this is how they did it. So this is the example I commonly use as a reference architecture, right? How do you define something from a pilot phase, and how do you take it to a scalable infrastructure, which is repeating and success? And then once you have that reference model, you can deploy it across other teams, right? So that's an example I would like to call from JP Morgan Chase. And yeah.
yeah, yeah. And in fact, Goldman Sachs also did a similar thing recently where they rolled out, an AI capabilities to 40,000 odd employees. And, they did a pilot initially and kind of scaled it, to bring AI capabilities on board across the enterprise. So the JP Morgan example, thank you for that. That kind of really puts things into perspective. And so Anil, you talked about AI for AI's sake, when you were answering the question earlier. And so on one end of the spectrum is this AI hype where where people are actually integrating AI for AI's sake, AIifying things, where AI wouldn't even make sense. At the other end of the spectrum is when you're trying to modernize legacy infrastructure, which is really, kneeling down under the weight of all of the recent developments in software that are coming across. So talking about that other end of the spectrum, it can be really problematic kind of integrating, AI into your existing legacy systems and workflows. So have you encountered this messy middle of AI adoption in your work? And what kind of new AI solutions did you kind of use to kind of combine them with old infrastructure and possibly get it running possibly get it running more
Yeah.
efficiently? What were some of the toughest integration challenges that way? Because legacy modernization can be slow, it doesn't happen overnight. So how do you navigate the AI waters in harmony with decades old systems?
This is something I can relate to, Devang, because my recent experiences, I can share some of the things I saw and how what systems I saw, right? Some
Yeah,
of the key integration challenges I have faced practically is one is, like as you clearly said, incompatibility with the modern stack, right?
yeah,
Legacy assets or systems often lack APIs, and they
yeah,
used like outdated programming languages like PHP, right? For example,
yeah,
PHP is out, right? And then they have very rigid closed architectures, and then it makes it hard for the modern AI tools to connect, process data, and scale effectively. So that's one thing I have experienced firsthand. Now, the other thing I've also experienced is data silos and poor data quality. Data is trapped in multiple isolated system. Formats are not consistent, and then the records are incomplete, and it
yeah,
basically cripples the whole AI performance. So AI is not able to perform optimally with such incomplete data, right? AI,
yeah,
AI, as you know, it can thrive in a clean, accessible, unified data. That is the bottom line for AI to be successful, right? The other area I've seen is with legacy, framework is security and compliance risk. Older systems may not support modern encryption like AES 256-bit encryption, right? Or encryption in transit, or access controls for that matter, right? And this raises the risk when sensitive data is exposed to new AI models. That's another thing I've seen. Resource and documentation gap, that is a very common across. Limited scalability, you can't, it's not easy to scale legacy system that can handle
yeah,
the computational demands of AI, especially for real-time analytics or large-scale automation, right? And now how I was typically navigated the challenges is, for example, using few best practices, right? One is using something like an API or a middleware bridge to offset the problem, the gap. So I use custom middleware API wrappers to connect legacy system with AI platforms. And this allowed for me to exchange the data in the format and AI model requires, have some kind of a real-time inference without overhauling the core legacy system. And then, for example, in the healthcare example I talked about, we wrapped legacy EHR systems with secure APIs. So that way the AI-powered system can access patient data while still maintaining HIPAA compliance. The other thing we had a program called data modernization, right? Where we simply recognized the need to implement some kind of transformation layer through ETL pipelines like glue jobs, right, in AWS cloud, right? And data lakes, setting up data lakes to centralize, clean, and structure data from different fragmented, sources. And that
yeah,
was very non-negotiable. Building that clean data lake was very important for the AI to work. In addition to the ETL transformation layer, the pipeline which we built. The other one is more like a phased approach where the roadmap and what we developed and the planning we did, we phased the integration rather than a big bang approach. So I recommend starting with non-critical workflows like reporting automation and gradually progressing towards expanded AI footprint, right? That is important. This reduces not only the risk, but it also builds like the confidence to the whole company, right? The other
yeah,
one I've very important is, instead of building from scratch, if you want to go like faster, I would highly recommend to use cloud-based AI services you could use across AWS, Azure, or GCP, right? That's very important to leverage cloud AI because everything is integrated, comes to you like off the bat, right? It allows you to run heavy workloads, minimize, the load on legacy infrastructure, enable rapid scaling, right? If you want to do that. The other part is that it's important to have automation testing set up and refactoring also, being set up. And finally, I would say that having a matured change management and training is important, where you're training constantly your staff and your business leaders, and that is very important. Having an effective change management and training programs. And I mean, the
yeah,
real world example I can call out is that when I was reading through and researching about who has done this successfully, is Walmart, right? So Walmart has built AI algorithms that can seamlessly integrate into the legacy supply chain systems. So they had this layer of AI on top of existing infrastructure using APIs and cloud-based analytics. So they achieved real-time demand forecasting, for example. They were able to reduce inventory cost without any disruptive, overhauling to the system, right? And even healthcare, one I talked about earlier, right? The use case around interfacing with legacy EHR systems, electronic health record system, right? Unlocking again the insights into how you maintain compliance and uptime. So those are some of the examples. I've been associated with Walmart, and then my own use cases around healthcare, where we saw this advantage. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, so you talked about data being scattered across silos and, and then structuring them into a central data lake that kind of improves access and, maybe even incorporating cloud because you're running around with GCP and AWS and you already have, things ready to use, right off the bat. So it kind of prevents things being, built from the ground up. I was also wondering, when you say data being scattered, I think that would be a major problem in healthcare and life sciences in particular, because you have data on-prem and then you also would have data spread across multiple private clouds, some of it on public clouds. So is that a problem, considering that you cannot really have all of the, sensitive confidential data on cloud, and you might also have to deploy AI, on the endpoints themselves, in order to be compliant. So do you think that's
Yeah.
even a valid question? And do we have AI capabilities that suffice at the endpoints themselves, or is moving to the cloud the only solution that we have at the moment?
I think, I can talk from my own experience, right? So yes, there are different layers where data is maintained, right? For example, in a typical life sciences world, you are in like genetic testing kind of a domain, right? So you're
Yeah.
basically going through samples from patients, you are extracting the RNAs, DNAs, proteins,
Yeah.
you're finding for
You've
mutations, right?
actually led
Yeah.
genetics gene-based medicine, so really curious, yes, to hear your thoughts
Yeah.
on that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it goes through various life cycles, right? So now the moment you extract and sequence the patient sample data, right? So you're talking about raw data
Yeah.
for particular, sample, right? So that's one part. Now, yes, you're absolutely right. So those are sensitive data, which is you think about putting that on the cloud, right?
Absolutely. I
So,
mean, the human genome, so it's kind of like a
genome,
highly
yeah.
sensitive. Yeah.
Highly sensitive, right? So that is one part of where you're dealing with that kind of silo, which is actually important and is required. Now, second layer when you come is you're trying to process that. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to, find the biological structure of the mutations of that particular, patient based on the gene type and other things, right? So there you're also deriving more data models and more you're transforming data from raw sample to a more enriched, format. Again, you're
Yeah.
storing it and maintaining it in a storage. So again, that could be a decision where whether you want to store it on the cloud or on-prem is another thing. And then you have these step functions, like where you're going through different stages of cleansing data, you're deriving the results. So your job is basically to get to a result. You can share that to the patient and the doctor. So that to getting to that results requires a lot of clinical diagnostic process, right? Where our real
Yeah.
humans are sitting, they're reviewing the variants, they're reviewing the data from real patients and samples, whatnot. So that clinical diagnostics team does that job of creating a report that can be then shared with a patient and a doctor, right? So like typically when you talk about hereditary cancer screening and other rare disease kind of screening, it's important to not only get the data precise because it impacts the patient, it impacts the
Yeah.
doctor and the patient relationship and what kind of treatments they provide. So that's so when you talk about this whole what I just laid out, the life cycle and processes, so you're dealing with data across different systems, processing happening differently. And what I found is that um, processing takes a lot of time. So that's where we leverage, I would leverage cloud as an example to where you can, in on-prem, it is difficult to achieve that kind of processing speed. So, I
Yeah.
mean, that's where we decided how do we leverage cloud for what part and how do we bring back the results? Where do we store the results, right? So I would say that offset your bulk processing to cloud, but then when you're talking about raw data or results on the extreme left and right, then you can talk about bringing it back to on-prem, right? So that's kind of how I would navigate how I would put something on a cloud versus on-prem.
Yeah, and you also mentioned controlled access earlier in our conversation, where you said, it's critical to kind of restrict access, kind of sandbox applications, so they're only running where you really want them to, and that kind of helps keep things on track in a secure manner. So yeah, yeah, that completely makes sense. And so let's say you've modernized something. I mean, building an AI system is just the start. really a part of an ongoing effort. So, what's your approach on monitoring and updating AI models? Once they're deployed, once they're up and running. So, do you kind of have a playbook or a process for detecting when a model's performance is drifting? Or when the data has changed? You mentioned data drifts earlier, and automation to kind of bring things back on track. So, any insights on keeping AI systems delivering value? Even 6 months or year down the line after the initial deployment. That excitement has already passed.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? Because once you've done the hard work and got to a stage where you're dealing with more mature, accurate models, right? So you got to have a multi-layer approach and to address these technical or organizational realities, right? For example, one is you got to think about the pilots you did and does it align to the KPIs that you established? Does it align to the clear business goals that you have? That is one way to kind of revalidate your effort and your work. The second part is that building a more adaptable and scalable infrastructure, right? Either on the cloud, on-prem, but on the cloud mostly, right? How do you invest in that shared cloud native infrastructure? And how do you build MLOps pipelines? That's an area. And then you also have to build a seamless scaling for these pilot data sets into more enterprise volumes. And then you got the using distributed architecture with a dynamic workload allocation to handle spikes in data and user is something that I would also think about designing, right? And then finally, the data governance and security. If I can build as part of my design and build phase, I would do that. And establishing these data pipelines, end-to-end data pipelines with strong governance is important. Where you're in addition to having data, cleaning data, unifying, and then you're monitoring data flows for quality and compliance checks, which I just called out earlier, right? Enforcing access control is important. Having encryption at rest in transit is important. Audit trails to protect those sensitive data is important. Reviewing user access audits is also important periodically, especially in regulated sectors like healthcare, where an
Yeah.
audit happens, you have to come clean. You got to show them the process of you're doing this periodically. It's not a one-time activity. That continuous compliance checks and activity is important. Finally, I would also want to think about edge case handling. For example, if I want to trace or triage or detect some edge cases like monitoring real world usage of where the models fail, using human in the loop processes to review and categorize these cases, and stress test for fairness, right? You got to have diverse data sets so the model is not biased. So you have fairness and non-biased kind of things you built into the model. And then finally, I would also think about rolling out incrementally with the feedback loops, right? So you got to deploy in stages. Start with limited users, have some feature flag, start with non-critical workflows, gather more feedback, iterate again, keep iterating, and use continuous monitoring to track the model performance. Review with security, make sure you have all the controls in place. User adoption is important when you drive it, right? And then obviously you got to research and adapt to any new challenges that emerge. So those are some of the ways I would think about real world deployments. And also getting those edge cases right is important in addition to security and compliance. Partnering with them, reviewing what you have built, and having the continuous process is important. So this is kind of how I would treat the AI projects or products, and how I would take it to production scale and monitor.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, makes sense, yes. And we talked about this fear, Anil, that AI might replace, human creativity. Well, I mean, this is, it's funny that I'm even bringing this up because we talked about the human in the loop. But just for the sake of an argument, you suggested that AI can actually augment human ingenuity. I remember us talking prior to this call about this, where you mentioned your thoughts. So how do you see AI acting as a creative partner or a tool, maybe you've seen real examples where AI helped a team brainstorm ideas, solve a problem in a novel way, essentially boosting creativity, human creativity rather than stifling it. So, any such experiences? And I know you've also talked about how AI is reshaping the way teams work, having a major bearing on the future of work. So, are there any tasks or workflows that you've seen AI handle that kind of free human workers to focus on more high level or creative work? So how do you see this interplay between AI and the future of work and the human factor happen?
Yeah, I think what caught my mind, Devang, is the term you used, like creative partner, right? I think when you talk about the AI being a creative partner, I think your mindset is already aligned to how do you seamlessly use AI for your day-to-day work, right? And some of the ways I've seen how AI could augment the human creativity is that you talked about brainstorming and ideation, right? For example, that's a great way to start off. Now, there are tools like, Draw Mind or ClickUp. So those AI tools, those AI brains can help teams organize their thoughts, generate new directions, or even predict next steps based on previous sessions. So it maintains that track and traceability of what was discussed and what was brainstormed, and it takes up the ideation to a next level where you're talking about use cases. That's one example, right? And it's also about like the changing the more divergent thinking or breaking the bias. AI can suggest unexpected combination and expert bias, so it can help teams to break out the thinking patterns, habitual thinking patterns. It can analyze vast data sets. It can uncover patterns and opportunities that human intuition might overlook. It basically expands your creative horizon with access to more information and more data in a much more faster way, right? So you can go a little more faster. The other thing I've seen advantage is that rapid prototyping and visualization is something I've seen in product design, where
Yeah,
GenAI tools like Viscom and can instantly turn the 2D prototype to 3D prototypes, allowing designers to iterate and gather more feedback much faster than traditional methods, right? So that's another example where you can take rapid prototyping and visualization. And also the personal content creation and applications or AI applications are generating more tailored market stories, visual assets, more magazine style narratives, right? So those are some of the things like Advaya solution, for instance. They use LLMs to create personalized content for landscape designs and other things. So that's an example of what they did successfully, right? Yeah, I mean, boosting team creativity, as you rightly said, accelerating design and adoption and innovation, right? And then those are some of the ways we should think about AI and how to use it as part of our day-to-day work.
yeah, yeah. And bringing you back to the enterprise deployments, I was wondering, you mentioned the drifts that happen in data all the time, and we also talked about maintaining, AI and upgrading AI once it's been deployed. So have you ever, I mean, I'm sure there must have been several instances, but have you ever seen a particular, instance where you kind of recall a model behaving very unpredictably in production? And if so, how did you kind of course correct? But what were the key takeaways? So I'm asking this from the point of view of a listener, a senior executive leader who's really surprised looking at the way the model started, digressing from the way it was originally anticipated to work, and how should they, kind of course correct it?
I think you talked about very important thing you talked about is the accuracy and trustworthy, and then hallucinations and bias
Yeah,
and real world complexities, right? And some of the ways I would control mitigate these issues are, for example, employing a technology called RAG and grounding, so retrieval augmented generation, right? What it does is it combines LLMs with real-time knowledge retrieval from enterprise database, right? Or trusted sources which you can put in. It can ground responses in facts, and then it can reduce hallucinations, by employing that RAG and grounding method. Right. One of the example is where in healthcare tech, RAG was used so that any clinical or billing answer was supported by up-to-date and compliant documentation, right? So that's one use case which we're able to build. The second technique is using some kind of advanced prompt engineering. There are two methods I can think of right now. Of course, there are more. One is chain of thought prompting, which Perplexity and other tools use, right? It basically forces the model to reason step by step,
yeah,
involving logical consistency and reducing errors by like significant percentage, right? The second technique in advanced prompt engineering is called few shot prompting, where you embed an example in the prompt to guide the model towards the context correct and enterprise specific output. So these are the two methods where you're trying to achieve more accurate results, right? Chain of thought prompting and few shot prompting, where you give the model the reference of what your response should be like. The other
yeah,
thing is the testing and monitoring, like for real-time monitoring is important. Feedback loop is important. Every user interaction is an opportunity for improving your model, right? Feedback should be logged, analyzed, and used to retrain or fine-tune models. It became it becomes natural requirements when you want to fine-tune your model and make it better, right? So user feedback loop is very important. when they're asking a prompt over a prompt, the model should understand that user is not happy and satisfied for the same subject. They're using different prompts because they didn't get the answer they intend to. That's an important feedback in the loop. The other way is
Yeah.
addressing bias mitigation and data quality. So you have to curate diverse training data sets. That's very important. Multitasking with learning with bias classifiers is important. Continuous retraining of model with the real or feedback from the users is also important, right? And then you can have human oversight is important. As I said, you have to monitor and look at the results and the prompts to compare how accurate the model was able to respond to a specific question. Finally, I would say some kind of a quality control or cross verification of the output, like cross referencing output with trusted sources and fact checking tools, validate the governance content, AI content before it can reach to users. So
Yeah.
a lot of these companies use that layer to validate before the response is prompt is given to the user, right? I mean, they have different proprietary algorithms to do that. They may have some kind of a trusted source or a data source where they fact check the response before giving it to the user. That's one way. They call it confident scoring, which means responses below certain confidence threshold are flagged for clarification or escalation. I mean, they have to go back through the model and reduce the assertive inaccuracies, right? These are some of the ways to achieve working on LLM kind of a model, right? Prompts are quite important. The feedback loop is also very important.
Some very crucial points in there, Anil. And that really kind of mirrors your experience, technical, organizational, strategic. So I just have one quick question. Let's say you're speaking to a CXO. What's the one insight about leading AI at scale that you would really like to share with every executive embarking on their journey? Something that can only be learned through real experience like yours, not from consulting frameworks or best practice guides out there, something that only comes from experience.
Okay. Yeah. See, one thing I can practically think of is employing a proactive or continuous monitoring in the process is one best practice. Like I would employ the monitoring early, like from development through production all the way, track the models and operational metrics. For example, they call it F1 score for model accuracy, right? AUC is another way to look at the model performance, right? And operationally, you would look at latencies, you would look at uptime, user engagement, resource allocation at runtime. So that's another way I would want to look at. And also some setting up some kind of automation alerts where the certain thresholds are set up for key metrics like trigger notification or performance drop or anomalies are not detected, those things, right? The
Yeah.
second best practice I would advocate is having some kind of a detecting and responding to model drift, because when you
Yeah.
model, right, so you have to monitor for data and model drift, which means you use things like population stability index, PSI they call it, and Z score is another way to track it. These are the ways you use to compare the input data with predictions against historical baselines. So and then you got to set up pipelines to automatically flag these significant changes to the distribution or performance degradation. So that pipeline will constantly feed you all these changes to the distribution and performance, right? Continuous evaluation is important, where you're regularly validating the predictions with new labeled, grounded or labeled data that becomes more available, right? So you got to have access to more labeled data. And feedback loop is important, where you integrate user and stakeholder feedback to catch the real world issues. The third best practice is retraining and data refresh, retaining the models on fresh, diverse, high quality data, automate data pipelines, version control using ML flow or DBC is important. Governance auditing, like routine audits, documentation, change management process, evolving that is important. Infrastructure stability is also important. Cloud native is good to go, is allowing dynamic scaling, and as data volumes increase, user demands grow, cloud can
Yeah.
automatically scale up, right? And then automated rollback strategies is another best practice. When a model version is underperforming, you can quickly go back to a stable baseline. That's one way, to employ. Yeah, these are the some of the ways to look at more sustainable value and how to reduce and how to use AI in the context of enterprise and scaling up to users' demands.
Oh, wow, those are really important points. Thanks, Anil. And yeah, so Any closing remarks? I know there's a lot to talk about, but anything that you'd like to share with our listeners, our readers, maybe something you'd like to share about what you envision for AI, the future of AI, the trends that you're excited, to look out for. What do you think about
Some of the,
AI?
yeah, Devang, this is it's evolving, right? Whatever I say might be obsolete tomorrow, right? But
Yeah,
I'll try to be honest with what I see as a trend, right? So AI, first of all, before I go there, AI projects is more transformational. It's not a technology project. It's about culture, adaptability, about leadership, collaboration, having diverse set of teams involved in a journey. That's unlike any cloud transformation or other projects, right? That's one thing I would want to walk out, right? The other
yeah,
part, the other part I would walk out is when AI is making more leap is, for example, I've seen where if you want to lead AI effort, what I've learned is you got to lead by example. You have to model lifelong learning. That's very important. Like what came out, and I keep doing that in LinkedIn too, like researching others, what their contributions are, researching my own content of what's out there, right? Evolve AI is an example, which I just read this morning. That's a new learning for me, right? For example. So making learning accessible is important and an ongoing in a practical way. So you don't have like pages, but you're sharing enough information so everybody gets it. Encouraging experimentation and safe failure environment is important. Fostering knowledge and collaboration is very important asset to take AI to the next level. Aligning learning with business goals and individual growth, again, that's more people management and team management. And then I think the bottom line is that the fastest learners are not the biggest organizations, but they have to they have to think from ground up, and how do they upskill and train people from the ground up, is important. As now, finally, I would say the remark is major trends that are shaping AI's future is things like AI agents are making a lot of buzz now, and moving towards more autonomous agents is something I've seen, right? Where it's not only automating repetitive work, it's about proactively assisting users, reasoning, planning, executing, optimizing process end to end. That is the next trend I'm seeing using these LLMs. Advanced reasoning, multimodal capabilities, another trend to look forward to, where the models evolve. How does it have multimodal capabilities? Can it reason from video? Can it reason from unstructured data? Can it have some kind of a reasoning that is much more advanced, and basically allow you can process images, text, even video, and all that, right? So that's important. And the other third thing I've seen is that AI is moving from automation tool to a more intelligence decision kind of a tool. The focus is shifting from automating routine tasks to AI powered decision making, right?
yeah,
That's another trend I've seen. There's also the thing I've seen that it's a seamless human AI collaboration. The relationship between human and AI will evolve into a true synergy as we work as we go to the next year, 2026, 2027. It's going to become more synergy between humans and AI,
yeah.
and we should expect more intuitive interface or more loops, this feedback loops, user-centric design. And those are some of the areas I'm seeing. And also industry specific acceleration is something I would look at, like healthcare, fintech, manufacturing, energy, logistics, consumer creative sectors. Those are the areas where I would see more evolving of current AI capabilities, right? And then finally, I would say democratizing and use of responsible AI will also gain a lot of traction as the adoption increases. Low code, no code AI tools will emerge, and people like I wrote an article last weekend about vibe coding. So you don't need to be an advanced programmer. You can use natural English language to program stuff, right? So that's
Yeah.
another thing which was introduced early this year, but it's getting a lot of traction. And responsible AI, of course, comes with transparency, governance, and fairness of training data, right? So that's what I would look for, as we evolve and go through the AI journey together.
Yeah, and I think just today I read an article about a 16-year-old, somewhere on the globe who started a multi-billion-dollar AI startup, with her no-code experiments. So it's really fascinating where AI is taking us. And I think for me, the main takeaway from our interview today would be, just as you put it towards the end, you said AI is not just a technology; it's a it's transformation. So transformation keeps taking various forms. It comes in the face of the cloud. Sometimes it takes the face of AI. But yeah, it's ultimately transformation, deep down. So that thank you for that beautiful insight that kind of stays with me. And thank you, Anil, once again for joining us at Tech Leader. A big thank you to Anil Prasad for sharing his deep, actionable insights on everything AI, leadership, and innovation. If you found value in this conversation, please share it with your peers and stay tuned for more real world strategy for those building the future. Thank you, Anil. We hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Devang. Obviously, a lot of learning, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anil.